So, welcome to this month's Contractor ABU Online. This month, we are talking about preventing mistakes and minimizing liability. This is a little touchy subject because, as much as we hate to admit it or as much as we hate to see it, it is true that some walls do fail in our industry. And while it doesn't happen often, it does happen now and then, and uh, there's a variety of reasons that cause it to happen. When walls fail, there's lots of fingers pointing. You, as the contractor, may oftentimes get the initial blame or the fingers pointed at you. And the whole goal of today's presentation is to talk about one, how to prevent any mistakes, but then two, if something wrong does happen, how to avoid that liability and how to stay away from getting in trouble because hopefully you guys did install the wall correctly, and at that point, as long as you take the right steps, you should be free from any trouble. So, like I said, two main things with this presentation. The first is that we're going to make a path to ensure mistake-free installation. When walls fail, again, it's bad to see, but the easiest way to avoid it is to make sure that they're designed and installed correctly in the first place. That's really the only way to um, prevent this type of failure. If the wall is all designed and installed correctly, and something happens with the site that causes it to fail anyways, then that oftentimes is out of your hand and you can't get in trouble for anyways. But the most important thing is to be proactive rather than reactive when it comes to this wall installation and making sure that the walls that you guys are installing get put up correctly. The other thing to do is, or that we're going to talk about in this presentation, is how to minimize damages when those walls do fail and how to steer clear from any liability or getting in trouble. And so, getting started, right here we're talking about things to do before the wall goes up to ensure that the wall gets installed properly and no mistakes are made. And really, the first thing is training. And a good way to get trained or to get all of your employees trained is through Allen Block's contractor certification. It's a two-step process where you guys sign up as contractors and you attend a class, a contractor certification class. And in those contractor certification classes, you'll learn a ton of stuff. I'll get into it in just a little bit, but that's the first step of the contractor certification. And the second step is to actually go out there and build a project after you've done the class. And once you have attended a class and built your first project, then you become an Allen Block certified contractor. So there's a few really important things about contractor certification that makes it so valuable in putting up these walls or installing these walls. The first is obviously it's going to show you how Allen Block products work. So if Allen Block is a new wall system to you or segmental retaining walls are new to you in general, this is the most important thing is if you're going to be designing with Allen Block or if you're going to be installing Allen Block, it's important to know how the product works. We're a little different than some of our competition, how we are a front lip system. So it is a little different. So it's important to really learn that when you go to this certification. Another thing is that we talk about basic principles for wall design and design methodology, and these are two really important parts for any retaining wall design. Obviously, if retaining wall installation is new to you in general, it's hugely important to make sure you get the basics of how any segmental retaining wall works on site and the steps to really install those correctly and also to be able to look out for things that are maybe designed incorrectly or any red flags that you might see. And then again, with design methodology, this comes into play when certain methodologies might be spec'd for a product or a project that you're working on. So it might have to meet certain standards, and it's important to know which standards are met so that you're hitting those marks correctly, and if things do go wrong, you've met the marks you were supposed to. Now, in this certification, we also talk about why walls fail, and knowing why walls fail is a great way to learn how not to make walls fail. So you'll learn the common mistakes people make that we'll dive into in a little bit, but it's just great to see how, I guess, how walls go up that are unsuccessful so that you know how to successfully put them up. Now, another great thing about it is that we talk about our estimating tools and we talk about how you can properly estimate out a wall so that you don't give an improper bid that could get you into trouble, or you don't end up with too much extra product that you're going to have to pay a little bit or lose a little bit of money on to give it back to your producer. Now, we also talk about how Allen Block works with geogrid reinforcement. As you guys know, geogrid reinforcement is very important for any retaining wall design. Uh, More often than not, a wall is going to have reinforcement unless it's a small gravity wall. So it's really important to understand the connection between GeoGrid and the Allen Block product so that you know the proper steps to take to install that and make sure that it's the correct parameters for your wall project. We also talk about proper methods for constructing Allen Block walls, and not only the proper methods for it, but we actually are going to take you out into a hands-on session where you actually get to build that product to see what it's like to actually install that wall. The best way to learn in these situations is to do it yourself, and that's really what we focus on in that hands-on session, is getting you to go into the sandpit and level your base, level your first course of block, and then build the wall up from there, backfill and compact. So all the important steps for installing your retaining wall we talk about in this contractor certification. Now it's also important because there's all of these other benefits to it as well. So some of the main benefits with the Allen Block training is that you can use it to train new employees at your company. So if you guys have some summer help, or if there's some new installers that haven't worked with SRWs much in the past, they can attend these Allen Block training courses, contractor certification classes, to really get a grasp of how to install these walls correctly. This training is also going to set yourself apart from competition. So when customers are looking for contractors to design their wall, they're going to look for those certified contractors. And when you've got that Allen Block certified next to your name, it's really going to stand out for your customers. Now, the class will also show you how to improve efficiencies and make sure you guys are working to the best of your ability. You want to make sure you hit deadlines so you don't get into trouble with taking too long on projects, and learning how to use the product and becoming familiar with it at the training courses is really going to help you keep the efficiency that you need to not get in trouble with that. And we also talk about best practices. Best practices is something that Allen Block has worked with the NCMA to kind of hit a zero wall failure initiative. And that initiative is something that we've been working on in the past few years to really make sure that all of the important parts of installing a wall get hit correctly. And then some other benefits are that you can receive rewards, or it's also ICPI accredited. So there's benefits outside of just learning how to use the product correctly. It can also help you personally, and it's easy to get people in when they know that after they're a certified contractor, they get some rewards as well. It's a nice encouragement. And then lastly, and arguably the most important thing, is that you're going to learn common installation mistakes and how to fix them. We'll talk about those common mistakes in a little bit, but it's really important to learn not to run away from your problems, and make sure to address them right away to avoid any future issues. So that's really the importance of the training. But being in the classroom and learning all this stuff is one thing. What's really important is crossing that over into the real world, or onto the job site. So when you go through that training, there's a few things that it's going to be beneficial in the real world. So you're going to learn the importance of getting an engineer-approved design. That really saves you a lot with this liability stuff. the engineer is trained to design these walls. Obviously, the design is on them in these situations, and when you get a stamped design and you build it to how it was stamped, exactly how it was designed, you stay out of trouble there. So uh, really, it's just a good way to avoid that design build problem where you might design a project, and if you're not familiar with the product too well or how to design it, you could get into trouble with not doing it properly. The other thing is that it's going to make you aware of some red flags that you might see. So, like I just said, engineers are designing these projects, but sometimes the engineer doesn't always know the best for the site. And in these classes, you'll learn the basics of retaining wall design, just the general stuff. We don't expect you to go out there and design projects yourself necessarily, but it is good to know the red flags so that if you do see a faulty design or you do see something that's kind of raising that red flag, making you feel sick to the stomach, it's important to address that and maybe contact your local Allen Block representative about it if you've got some issues with it. And the other thing is red flags on the site. So when you go onto the site, if you see pooling water or you see poor soils, it's important for you to note that so that when the wall is being installed, uh, you address those situations beforehand and it's not something that surprises you. Obviously, we want nice soils and we want water to stay away from our wall, so it is important to spot those red flags on the site. Now, we also want you to know the limitations of a segmental retaining wall. Obviously, we love it when you design with segmental retaining walls, but there are some limitations to it. You know, they can be used for almost any circumstance or any situation, but on those situations where it isn't the best fit or it's not going to work out perfectly, we don't want you to use our product. Uh, it's made for a specific application, and if it doesn't hit that application, it's doing nobody any good designing with it. Um, if you guys design with or if you guys build with a product that isn't going to work, it's going to fail, and that's going to be negative for everyone. So it's important to know those limitations. And then, again, one of the biggest things here is crossing over into the real world. That training is going to show you that it's always good to ask questions or to never be afraid to ask questions. Um, we want to make sure that everything that you guys learn in the class is, I guess, applicable to the real world. And when you come across something that we didn't talk about in class, we want you guys to contact us or contact your representative so that we can really answer that question and make you confident in the choices you're making and confident in how the wall is going up so that you don't have to worry about it and you steer clear from any issues if the wall does fail, which if you install everything correctly, it should not. So then moving away from the training, we're going to talk about some things you can do before you begin installation of the wall that can really help minimize those mistakes. And the first things are going to be to speak to the owner or the customer and the stamping engineer, or the designing engineer. And what that's going to do is, one, when you speak to the owner or the customer, you're really going to make sure that what you're installing is what they're looking for. The last thing you want is to put up a wall and the customer sees it and they say, hey, this is not what I asked for. It's not what I'm looking for. I need you to redo it. That's, again, a horrible thing, and we want to avoid that at all costs. And one way to do that is to talk to the stamping engineer and really become familiar with what they're providing you. They should provide you with a final design, but also a site plan with the design. And that's something that we want you to become familiar with. When you know that site plan and you've studied it and you know the design and how it's supposed to be put up, it makes managing that installation of that wall so much easier. It's good for you to understand all of this stuff because if someone comes up to you and asks a question, or one of your employees comes up and asks you a question, it's good to know it off the top of your head and be confident in it rather than having to scramble to find an answer and potentially say something that isn't correct. So it's really important to know those site plans and design like the back of your hand when you're starting a project. The other thing that we want to do is get to know the site. Like I mentioned before, if there's puddled water or there's poor soils, we want to know that so that we can talk to the engineer about it so that they're aware of it. Um, but then we can also help avoid future problems by routing that water away from our wall, or making sure that the rest of our infill or backfill of our wall is from off site, because we want that granular material. It's things like that make it so important to know the site. Now, another thing is that we want to note any unique circumstances and ask questions. So, if there's anything you're unfamiliar with or you see something that's a little unique, we want you to note that. Take pictures of it, write it down, jot it down as a note, and then we want you to ask us about it or contact your Allen Block representative in your area about it. The last thing we want is for you to dive into an unknown situation without an answer or without a confident solution that either we provided or our representative provided. And then another good thing is to have that pre-construction meeting. And the pre-construction meeting is just going to make sure everyone's on the same page. Everyone is, working together and knows where their boundaries are and what they're providing to the project. And then, of course, all the information that you gain and all the information that you have going into the project, you want to share that with the rest of your crew. You want to make sure everyone that's going to be working on this wall is familiar with how it's going to go up and the proper way to install the wall. And then lastly, I'll talk about it in a bit, but Allen Block has a lot of literature, and inside of some of that literature, you'll find this pre-construction checklist. It is in both our commercial install manual and our spec book, but what it's going to do is give you a checklist of things to make sure you've completed before you begin installing the wall. And that's really going to save you not only time trying to figure out what you need to do before the wall, but it's going to give you kind of peace of mind because you've taken all the steps before the wall goes up to ensure that everything you're doing is correct. Now, once we move past that pre-construction, we move into installation. And during installation, this is one of the most important things you can do to avoid liability in the future and to really verify that you're doing everything correctly is take pictures. So when you're putting that wall up, take pictures of you compacting or take pictures of you backfilling every course. We want to make sure that we have documentation of you doing everything correctly so that if something does arise later on, we've got proof that the wall was installed correctly. That's really, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And having those pictures is going to make it very clear that the wall was installed correct. Now, the other thing is that we want to follow plans and designs. So oftentimes, if a wall was designed a certain way, there's a reason for that. And following those plans is going to make sure that, you are doing what the stamping engineer approved or what they instructed to do. And that helps because if something does go wrong and you followed the plan exactly, you should not get in trouble for that. That should be on the designing engineer then if something was wrong with the design. So again, if you stray from that design, you can be liable, even if you weren't the reason that the wall failed. Again, I've said it a few times, but we want to note any unforeseen circumstances, and we want to let the designer know about them. That's really so. If you're installing the wall and you come across some groundwater, like in the excavated zone of the soil, that's something you should communicate with the designer so that they can potentially change the design to account for that, because that will add hydrostatic pressure behind the wall and could affect how the design currently is. So it's important to make sure that they're aware of anything you come across while installing the wall. And then this one, it seems like a stupid point, but we want to make sure we avoid mistakes. And we'll talk about common mistakes on the next slide, but it's so important to really use what you learned at the Allen Block contractor certification and contractor training so that the wall that you install doesn't have anything wrong with it. The last thing we want is for GeoGrid to not be installed correctly, or um, we don't want the, I guess, compaction to be too far away, anything like that. So it is important to avoid those mistakes. But then once you're done, once you finish the wall, it's a good idea to make sure that someone is checking off the wall. So you want someone to inspect the wall and say, hey, these people have, or you guys have installed the wall. It's done correctly. We've inspected it. Everything looks right. That again is another way to document that you installed the wall correctly. But now getting into some common installation mistakes, these are some things that we've seen a lot that have led to either wall failures or potential issues with the wall. So some common challenges, the first one is going to be improper compaction. Now that could be using the wrong equipment to compact, or it could mean that you're having too much space in between compaction. We say to compact every 8 inches, and really you don't want to go any more than that. Some people will try to compact every 16 or 24 inches, but the compaction equipment you're using, so those plate compactors, really are only going to compact about 4 inches worth of material. So if you get any more than 8 inches, there's a ton of that wall rock or that's not getting compacted, and that's a big issue. Oftentimes that'll lead to settlement, and your wall will start to droop, and you'll get the smiling look on your bond. The other thing that we see a lot of is people stacking multiple courses before backfilling. So again, we want to backfill and compact every single course, every 8 inches. And so when you put up 3 courses and then decide to backfill and compact after that, that compaction isn't transferring all the way through the material. And like I said before, you're going to get that slouching of the wall or the settlement over time. You can see here's a picture of a wall that went up where there was blocks a ways down. I think they went 3 courses up without backfilling, and that is an issue. Another thing is that we want to make sure that our grid is placed properly. So as you guys know, grid comes in 2 different variants. There's uniaxial and biaxial. Uniaxial will have strength in one direction, while biaxial has strength in 2 directions. So it's important to know which one you're using and that it's being used correctly. And then the other thing is that we want our grid to be pulled tight. We don't want it bunched up because then it's not doing its job. It's not going to work if it's bunched up. And an issue that we sometimes see is not enough excavation happens so that that grid can be pulled back and pulled tight. You can see in this picture here, this is actually the same wall as the other picture. They didn't excavate far enough behind, and so they didn't have enough room to place that grid and pull it tight. So you can see it's all bunched up. That grid that's bunched up is not doing anything. It's not doing its job there. And that's a big issue with the wall because where the design may have, needed that full length of GeoGrid, it's not even getting half of it. Another thing to look out for is incorrect aggregate or soil. Again, we prefer to see that granular material behind the wall. It provides a lot of strength and stability with the friction angle that it has. So it's important to use the correct soils. We want to avoid those loamy sands or those wet clays. The friction angle on those soils is going to be not enough to really hold up that wall. So while they can work sometimes, we really encourage that granular material to be used as backfill. And then, of course, the biggest enemy of a retaining wall, is going to be water. So what we want to do is, the biggest thing is we want to make sure that our wall avoids water. So if we can push water away from it, use swales, anything like that to get water routed away from the wall, that's ideal. But then obviously some water is going to get in. So to stop incidental flow, we want to make sure that we have drain tile, or we want to have drainage in the wall. That's something that's very important, because if that water doesn't have anywhere to drain, it'll build up and put pressure on the back of the wall. So by having drainage, we're kind of giving an out for that incidental water, that little bit of water that can build up and cause so much issues. And again, there are water applications with our blocks where water goes halfway up the wall. Um, those are unique circumstances that are designed specifically for those situations. But for the most part, on your typical wall, we want water to avoid the wall. And there's plenty of other issues that can come into installation um, that we want to avoid. Too many to go through. So again, it's important to ask questions if you're ever unsure about anything, just because there's so many possibilities that could be installed incorrectly. We want you to make sure that you're confident in what you're doing. And so, what do we do though when a problem does occur? Are we going to run away from it? Of course, we're not. Um, just like any problems, when you run away from them or hide from them, it's only going to make things worse, and it's actually going to put more liability on you for avoiding that. So when things do happen, what are the best steps to approach it or to address it? So the first thing is that I'm going to say, it's not on this list, but the very first thing is to stay calm. Um, if a wall fails, a lot of fingers are going to be pointed. A lot of them will be pointed at you as the installer. It's just very important to stay calm, collect your thoughts, make sure that you have all of the information you need. So part of that is finding out what the issue was with the wall. Part of that is knowing what your role was on the wall, where your role started and where it ended. And then it's also important to know your company's expectations of you. So if you guys are owners, then you set that yourself. But if you're not, it's important to find out from your manager or your supervisor how you are meant to handle these situations where a wall fails and you could potentially be liable. If you are a manager or a supervisor, it's important for your crews to know that so that they don't do anything rash or that could get you guys in trouble. But the biggest thing is when a wall fails, we want to collect as much info as possible. Take those pictures, take notes on everything, ask questions about it, and then document all of that. We want all of that as proof later on and things that we can use as resources or that we can relate back to. And then all of that correspondence and information that we collect, we want to share that with our representatives just because they're the ones who are going to go on site and really make sure that everything gets handled properly and try to keep you away from any liability that they can. And having that information is going to be extremely valuable for them. Another thing to do is always rely on that Allen Block literature. Those set a good guideline for how things should be done or maybe what issues cause the wall to go down. So it's good to always reference back to that. And then again, I've said this so many times, but it really is the most important thing is we want to document everything. That documentation, like you see here, it does provide a great timeline of how the wall went up, how the wall was installed. It gives good proof of what you did, what work you did, because it's not always visible when it's behind the face of the wall. Take those pictures. The pictures are going to be super valuable in proving what you've done and showing that you did everything correctly. But also, besides for pictures, we want to save all of our conversations that we've had. So those emails that we've sent back and forth to the engineer or to the owner, the plans that we were given by the engineer, all of this stuff is very important for us because it shows us what we were given as contractors to install the wall. It tells us the roadmap or the directions that we were given. And as long as you followed those instructions and it's stamped by someone else, that's on them. And then, obviously, if you don't use this documentation, it's going to be helpful for someone else. So it is important to always collect that. But in summary, the main points to get from this are that the best way to avoid any liability is to build a wall that's not going to fail. And the training is key for that, making sure you understand how to install a wall correctly That's really going to make sure that the wall gets built properly and that it does not fail. But then it is important when you're designing that wall to be careful to avoid those common mistakes. There are things that can happen very easily, or even if a course is forgotten, it can be detrimental for the wall. So it's important to be very careful, to be very thorough in your installation. And then when problems do arise, we don't want you to run and we don't want you to hide, because that is only going to make things worse. Um, and you can't really avoid these problems after they've happened. And then lastly, we want you to get in touch with that representative and keep that documentation for everything, because that is what you're going to use to show that you did everything correctly, and you can be confident that how you installed the wall is how it should be installed. But really, that's the that's the main portion of the presentation for how to avoid those mistakes and avoid liability when it comes up. Uh, Again, we hate to see it happen, but it does. But really, I hope that this presentation kind of gave you a good idea of how you can help avoid those situations, and when you can't, how to address it. Is there any questions that you guys have? Okay. Well, it doesn't look like I'm getting any questions. So, with that, I will go ahead and end the presentation. Thank you guys again for taking the time to sit through this Contractor ABU online and I guess learn about minimizing liability and mistakes on wall projects. Thank you and have a great day.